So what's the difference between economics and strategy? I want to talk about specifically strategic management and in economics broadly. I've started taking courses in all sorts of these areas. I've now taught strategy for a long time, probably getting known for becoming a strategy innovation prof. So, I want to talk about what is the difference between economics and strategy. So if you don't know me, I am Professor Dave Matsack. I'm Associate Professor of Innovation Strategy and Entrepreneurship. And I created this whole reciprocity project to give back as much as I possibly can. There's so many people who help me out that I want to pay the favor for to help you out. So economics and the sort of view that that firms pursue profits is only one fraction of the strategy field. There's lots of people, so you can think of strategy, the big thing. So economics sort of has this view, a much more of a macro view, right? So they view firms broadly now that they're and they might sort of look at an entire industry, but there's people that actually look and study within the firm from an economics viewpoint. I'm thinking of like sort of a game theoretic perspective where they might sort of see things going forward and look at strategic actions between actors. There's lots of people that look at many of the overlapping things that we would look at in a strategy field, and sometimes strategy folks publish in economics journals, and sometimes economists publish in strategy journals, right? Like people that would recognize themselves as economists. And so what the key things are is just basically the questions that people are interested in and how they actually might pursue it. So strategy folks, there is a deep-rooted economics field or economic sort of foundation within a lot of mainstream strategy, but a lot of mainstream strategy too, and people that would sort of view themselves as strategy also are sociologists, and they view themselves deeply rooted within what's called organizational theory, and I'm probably more on that bent more than anything, although I understand a lot of the sort of economic fields or economic questions as well, and I read those journals. There's a small group of folks that are, and it's perhaps growing, that are interested in sort of the psychology of managers in general, sort of the micro foundations of that. And all of these are, you could think of these fields as, I wouldn't say that they're distinct fields, right? Like there's never one, and I don't have that sort of view of knowledge. I don't think that there's like these hard, carved out subfields and all that kind of stuff. They're more of blending, amorphous blobs where people are talking about similar conversations. And then what you have to do is sort of think about where these conversations are actually talking, or where those conversations are being made, right? So if you're doing more, more of a modeling effort, for example, like mathematical equations, and looking at, some sort of equilibrium that might result, or you're modeling the long-term consequences of some particular data that shows something interesting. Sometimes that goes into economics journals, but they do go into the strategy journals too, and they're really interesting, right? But those folks, they all kind of tend to know each other that are within those efforts, right? That they, even though that they're in different journals, they might be working on similar things, and they might sort of pull across within those particular domains. It just so happens that it overlaps a lot, right? So a couple of, distinct features. They're not like, I don't think economists are like, we would never ask these questions or view that in any, like hard and steadfast, but they're really kind of strong underlying tone to what's going on in economics compared to strategy. Strategy folks tend to look at the differences between performance or what is going on with performance. So understanding performance in general is pretty strategy-esque. Looking at what leads to performance. Economists, they're concerned with efficiency, I would say, in some of the questions, but they don't necessarily have to be performance oriented, if that makes sense. And sociologists would say, it doesn't matter. We're just looking at more of the normative things. And that's where economists tend to have more of a little bit more of, yes and no, like a more of a prescriptive kind of feel with it. So they have sort of a framework, an ideal framework, and what things work, or how things work. Sociologists tend to sort of state this is the way the world is and how it works, even though that there is some sort of theoretical boundaries that are within that. You can see it's hard to sort of have these discussions, right? And to say what is one thing versus another. It is really difficult, but definitely, strategy is concerned with the internal workings of the firm, but also there's lots of people that study the outside sort of workings of the firm, right? Like how they interact with the outside world. Political science, sort of more on the political science side of things, right? There's a lot that goes on in terms of what is, what we're trying to look at and what we're trying to say. But definitely that underlying belief that we're curious about performance of firms, that we know that the performance of firms is different across, I'm thinking, so Michael Leiblian has done a lot of work in this area, and I'm not, quite familiar at this point in terms of what his categorizations were, but definitely thinking about, the performance of firms, what is the differences between them, looking at how things are managed, what does, management actually look like, thinking of not only managers, but what does organizing look like within a company? What is the act of organizing? What are that there's a lot of questions, right? That we would sort of say, but generally we're interested in organizations, not specifically firms, although that there is a bend, particularly within strategy, towards Fortune 500 firms. But we're interested in organizations and explaining how organizations actually work. And we're a little bit more, opportunistic, that we borrow from, theories and fields that sort of explain this particular phenomenon quite well. And you see that actually a lot within strategy, or, organizational theory type papers, where we just, we're trying to explain something we might borrow from another field. Right? I study organizational learning. That's an analogy, basically, of looking at how we might view organizations as kind of like a learning organism of some sort, right? Like, it doesn't mean that there's this kind of learning as you might view, but there is this organizations, firms actually improve with experience over time, right? And maybe they don't improve. Some of the more interesting articles is wondering why they don't improve over time, right? So there is a lot of opportunistic behavior of pulling to explain how organizations actually work. And depending on who you talk to within the field, you might get people that would say you should just focus on performance only. That's the only thing that actually matters. And many people, and I'm of the opposite side of saying, like, no, there's a lot of things that go on other than just performance, and we should worry about those particular things as well. That's where I'm kind of more of a organizational theorist, right? So if you were to focus on just performance alone, efficiencies, that would be a little bit more on the economic side of things, right? But I'm bent on the opposite side, where I like to think about all sorts of things that happen, right? Like crazy weird things that happen within organizations. Can we make these distinctions between the two? Yes. Is it easy to make these distinctions? Not as easy as one would hope, but I think that's like knowledge creation, right? Like I don't think we should sort of set hard boundaries and sort of say this is one thing and this is the next. Because I don't think that is really fruitful for long-term discussion in the long run, right? Like eventually you want to borrow from other stuff. If you want to build a community, we sort of need to, be open and welcoming to different areas and different perspectives. I think that is totally fine. Is there moments where we would say, well, that's economics and that's strategy? Yeah, I would say definitely. Like if you start getting into fields that are outside of the firm, you might get into like the economics of education, for example. Well, that's probably, most people would say that really doesn't have an impact on strategy. However, the research methods that are employed, some of the natural experiments that are employed within, the economics and labor economics, economics of education and labor economics are pretty interesting. And we might look at those research methods. So it's a real tricky conundrum. However, generally strategy, strategy folks that study it are interested in organizations broadly, looking at management, looking at organizations, what organizing actually means, looking at performance, looking at the differences between organizations. Like those are pretty strategy questions and pretty strategy ideas. When does an organization, when do we create that? These are pretty strategy oriented in different degrees. So yeah, I think that there are differences there, but they're hard to carve out. And I think the only way that you can look at it's almost like artwork, right? Like when you look at artwork, you know what that artwork is, and that's often what it ends up doing and being. Not to say, and this is to emphasize the fact that a lot of great ideas come from other fields, and we should be open to those great ideas as well. So with that, leave me a comment on the podcast. Take care and have a wonderful day.